Hi, Ramesh. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Bala. Thank you so much for having me here. Look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Ramesh, you have had a very academic very academic oriented college and PhD and postdoc, and after that you even worked for the Indian Institute of Science as a professor. It's very rare, at least I have not come across a lot of professors in India moving the entrepreneurial route or taking the entrepreneurial route. Was that pure accident, or did you always plan to start something on your own?
Um, I wouldn't say it was pure accident. There was definitely a direction to it, a deliberate move. So when I finished my PhD in the US, my intent was to come back to India, and the driver behind that intent was obviously to make a make an impact in some form, with all of the knowledge that had been gained and would be gained over the years. So when I came back to India, there was a driver constantly to see how we can take the academic work that we're doing and translate it into applications. And that over a period of time, over 4 or 5 years, groups got formed, opportunities arose, and then the timing was right at the turn of the millennium to actually launch something that was more a company than an academic effort. Um, Not that we knew exactly what form and shape and what the evolution of this entity would be, but the intent was quite deliberate.
That's fantastic. The Gang of Four, the famous Gang of Four, you guys come together around the turn of the millennium to work on this very exciting project at the time called Simputer. How did you guys get to know each other, and what were some of the incumbent technologies at the time that sort of drove this Simputer project, or what was the gap that you were trying to identify at the time?
Yeah, the way we got to know each other, we were just all faculty members at the computer science department of the Indian Institute of Science. We'd all joined uh, in a maybe a 5 year window or so. And in that sense, we were relatively, co-joinees, and um, we've maybe chemistry, maybe just shared interest or shared drive to translate knowledge into applications. We just started talking to each other, and um, around the turn of the millennium, if you remember, uh, there was a lot of interest in bridging the digital divide, and there were a number of events run in Bangalore around that theme. It was clear that the Y2K problem was around the corner. The Indian IT services industry was starting to flower and take off. And with that came the view of IT is going to be the web revolution was well on its way. The mobile revolution had not happened yet, but there was an early semblance of that. Here and there, mobile phones were certainly being used, and uh, the question we asked in that context was simply, can the digital divide be bridged with a device that we can make in India that would be more Indian language friendly, Indian context friendly, etc., etc., made in India, and so on. So that's how that thought came about, and it happenstance that the four of us at the Indian Institute of Science happened to meet three others who were at this company called Encore, who are hardware engineers. We were all more software engineers or computer scientists, and that combination of seven, we ended up forming this so-called Simputer Trust, where as a non-profit, we sort of built the first version of the Simputer, and that's how the whole effort took place.
Hmm. Very interesting. So this was probably the time when pages were around and digital planners were around. Did those inspire you in any way?
Yes, so the BlackBerry was perhaps ruled the roost as far as the corporate world is concerned. People were using pagers. There was the odd mobile phone, certainly in outside of India, a few in India had, and those were all inspirations to say that look, I mean, when we look at these devices, none of them have. Now we take all of this for granted. None of them have a touch screen. None of them have the ability to write free form. None of them have local language content, and can be and from a technical perspective, none of them, from what I knew in those days, were that open source friendly. None of them were based on the Linux. Linux was a big thing at that point of time. Microsoft and iOS in the form that they existed in those days had ruled the roost, and or Mac OS, I should say, and Linux had come about as an answer to proprietary operating systems. As why should systems of software be proprietary? And so the confluence of all of that, can create something with a touch screen, with Indian content, with interactivity that none of these devices have, and is based on an open source software concept. And we, in fact, also toyed around with an open source hardware concept at that point of time. The first version of Simputer actually released with an open source hardware concept that people could take that hardware design and then implement it on their own. Right? So those were all the new things that came about, inspired by, of course, what was there in those days or what was not there, which is all the things that I listed.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. I was looking into what Simputer was set out to do or what it could do. Things like giving farmers data about pricing, weather forecast for fishermen, enabling micro banking. I mean, this was a time when the internet was not there yet. I mean, we were all using probably dial-up connections. Having this far-sightedness, was that always the vision of the team, that we need to be way ahead of our time? And what were some of the challenges because of this far-sightedness? Because sometimes technology can come about way before everything is matured, right?
Yeah, I mean, the intent was certainly not to be far-sighted. The intent was, this is a need that's not being addressed today, and let's address that need. In hindsight, of course, we realized that we were a little ahead, not too much, maybe a decade ahead, right? I mean, we've seen what's happened subsequently, and how devices have literally pervaded everybody's habits and mind share and daily routines. But our intent was, of course, that we will, this is a need. Let's build to it. Let's deploy. Let's make it part of people's lives. The challenges that resulted were, of course, when you are early in the game, and which you don't realize at that point of time, but you realize that later, is that it just requires more time, more investment, more talking about it, more awareness for this to take hold in the form that you want it to. And so the next several years was a journey towards that. Perhaps if we had started 5 years later, the reception, we may not have had to do all of that hard work, or it is equally possible that 5 years later there would have been just so many other people doing it, perhaps, that it would have been harder. But it was a good window, I would say, even looking back, to start something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the stories about the first Apple iPhone, where they had so many material science challenges and hardware challenges as well. We all know about the Gorilla Glass, etc. How challenging was it for you? Did you have to innovate from like a hardware standpoint? File a lot of patents and stuff, or come up with innovative material science technologies to make this to fruition?
I would say a lot of the innovation was more on the software than the hardware. The hardware, I think, had evolved at that point of time that one could get something together. I mean, the first version the Simputer, just to be clear, it took us how long? Less than a year for sure, maybe 6-8 months to start from scratch and assemble and build something that, of course, had the hardware, had the operating system, had the interface to an extent, and had some applications, including the touch screen and writing and stuff like that. Of course, it was not the sleekest, nicest looking thing. It was a little bulky, not as sleek as today's phones, etc. But it came together, and in 6-8 months. So in that sense, one could put something together relatively easily, right? But most of the innovation was on the software front to imagine what a good user interface looks like. I mean, interacting on a touch screen. Touch screens those days were not as like the whole notion of gestures and all kinds of swipes that we do were had not been imagined then, and so we had to imagine that. And I think bulk of the innovation was there, and most of it was with the stylus and the touch screen, and saying how does a stylus interact with the touch screen, and what all can we bring about on that touch screen. And I remember all kinds of interesting concepts had to be put in, including how do you have, I mean, today you swipe left and right. We had little widgets where you could touch the stylus to the touch screen, and the next set of widgets would emerge, and so on. So different from what phones do today, because the touch screens in those days were a little limited, but sort of approaching where we are today. The bulk of the innovation was on that front.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, was UX UI a thing then? Like, how did you come up with the whole, how does it face the customer, right? How was the user experience? Maybe such a role was not even in the limelight back then, like how it is today. So how did you navigate through that?
I would say it was largely passion and doggedness from certain members of the team. I would single out, I guess, Vinay in particular, who has this UI penchant, penchant, so to say, which is looking at things very carefully and experimenting ad nauseum until the right concept emerges, and creatively looking at various concepts. And so, yes, it was not something that software probably had not reached the level of UI UX sophistication that it has today. But I guess it's just the team had all kinds of, we had people with very strong desire to make the interface really good. We had hardware engineers who were very strong. We had sort of algorithm engineers who could make things. So all kinds of the team was really strong, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, thinking back, 2000s was a time when Silicon Valley still had that whole startup culture. So raising money, was that a problem? Did you guys ever think about moving the base to California to maybe just expedite or raise more money to make this a bigger project? Or did you guys always want to build it from scratch in India with the resources that you had at the time?
Yes, so India was certainly a central concept in our whole journey. I remember, I'll come to the fundraising for Simputer in a moment, but even when we were successful with Strand to raise funds, but every round amongst the first couple of rounds of funding, there was always pressure to say, flip the company to become a US incorporated company and India be a subsidiary, and we resisted all of that pretty strongly to say that we want to be, India incorporated. So coming back to the Simputer, yes, perhaps in hindsight we would have been more successful had we um, sort of raise money in the US. But those were days where we were not very that well connected, that knowledgeable about the whole fundraising business. We tried raising money in India. We had some limited, but very limited success. Um, the VC industry was at its complete infancy in India, I would think, and it took a decade or more for the investment industry, maybe even a decade and a half, though I would say a decade to get started at least, and then a decade and a half to really find its feet before the Indian investment industry really became mainstream, right? And so that's one of the tragedies of the Simputers. Even though the concept was so powerful and the market was there to be had, it could have been the first made in India sort of device. We just couldn't raise the level of funding that we needed um, to um, to take it to its logical conclusion. And therefore there was some stuttering and stammering over the next 5 years. We raised small amounts of money. We created new versions of Simputer. We were able to market it a little bit. We found largely B2B channels through which we could push it rather than really where it needed to go, which was out directly to the consumers and as a consumer device, right? And so um, so that and that's why the story didn't reach the levels of adoption that it should have. So perhaps going to California upfront may have made sense in hindsight. However, as I said, being a made in India device was certainly an important concept at that point of time.
Yeah, I mean, I recently heard the CEO of Zoho Corporation, Sridhar Vembu, talk about how he wants to keep his company private, and he is not worried about quarter to quarter results and so on. I mean, not everyone has that sort of a luxury, but yeah, I think when VCs come in, then you have to pivot every now and then and have to be answerable to shareholders, and it sometimes can cause difficulty. I mean, we can't probably say even in hindsight that would have been the best option, but yeah, definitely VCs were not in the game in India at the time, so I think it made sense for you guys to shy away from moving to California as well. Ramesh, there was also a plan to commercialize, right? So there was like you guys set up Pico Pita Systems to commercialize it. Like, why did you want to go that route versus having it as a trust, like you guys started?
So largely, again, these are calls one makes. Wikipedia continued to be non-for-profit, and just decided that's the way to do it. It could have been equally, keep it non-for-profit, attract funding through a not-for-profit scheme, and then several people did advise that route. But what was clear is that funding was not that easily forthcoming, and the call we had to make was, in what mode would funding be more forthcoming? And the commercial mode was something where it looked like at that point of time, after a couple of years of looking for non-profit money, that maybe we should go in that direction, and that's how the company came about. We raised small amounts of money. I mean, I would say not more than a few $1 million at any point of altogether. Also, I mean, which from today's perspective looks like a tiny amount of money, given how much more is available nowadays. But that's what we managed to raise to keep things going. So it was a call, which way you go. It's always in looking at it today, looking at Wikipedia's success, looking at Khan Academy's success, etc., there are equally good business models that one could have gone on in a non-profit mode. But we, anyway, though went into the commercial mode, hoping that we would be able to have more commercial focus and raise more money along that.
Yeah, fun fact. I mean, the website is still on www.picopeta.com. Yeah, I did take a look at it. I would definitely urge the viewers and the listeners of this podcast to go check it out. A project way ahead of its time. So even in the US, a lot of the companies that are actually making consumer hardware or devices are having it manufactured in Southeast Asian countries, mostly through contract manufacturers in China. What was the manufacturing of Simputer like? My best guess would be that China was not the manufacturing capital that it is today.
So we were doing, small scale manufacturing. It's one of the things that we learned. I mean, now that you touch on manufacturing, is our goal initially was to come up with a low cost device, right? And the one of the things we learned along the way is a low price device. Let's say cost is what it is, but a low price device. What we learned is, and this should be obvious 101 for anybody running a business today, but we were all newbies at that point of time, that the price to cost ratio is substantial. There are markups involved, and whatever your cost is, by the time you commercialize all your overheads, you have to at least multiply it by a factor of, I would say, 2 or 3. Including, if you have to go retail and the guy in the showroom taking his cut and so on. So, and that's number one. Number two is that the cost itself is heavily dependent on volumes. So there's a big chicken and egg problem here. I mean, if you want to price it low at, our goal was $100, $150, right, in those days. And if you were to price it at there, you have to have economies of scale of manufacturing. That only, you would have to go to China for that. I mean, we were doing small scale manufacturing in various places, including, we had a tie-up with, I remember, with Bharat Electronics Limited to make a particular version of the Simputer. There were foundries in China as well that would do things that we used. But we were doing relatively small scale, manufacturing at the scale of hundreds or thousands, maybe not hundreds of thousands. That's what is needed for real scale. And that would have been possible only if you sort of have the upfront investment to say, I'm going to get 100,000, I'm going to then launch a massive commercial exercise. And then over a period of time, all of this will break even. So that level of capital we could never get to.
Okay, very interesting. Now that, it's been 15 years since Simputer, do you still see, some of the firsts that Simputer had in devices coming out today, or at least in the early 2010s? What were some of the things that you guys probably thought about that maybe like a Microsoft or an Apple got to it way later?
Yeah, I mean, just the notion of a touch screen was not that common at that point of time. Yeah, of course, it was a stylus-driven touch screen as opposed to a finger-driven touch screen. But nevertheless, the whole touch screen, just a concept, has taken hold so firmly today. I can remember a number of other things. So
accelerometer was one of the firsts, right?
Accelerometer, indeed. So thank you for reminding me of that. So the accelerometer had. We had these games that we built where you could tilt the Simputer, and if there's a little ball on the screen, that ball would go gravity-wards. And we created games around that. And that's that came around much later. Text to speech. We had at least 3, I remember, working hard on this synthesis of speaking, making the Simputer speak out in 3 languages. So you could give it text and it would speak it out in, I remember, Hindi, Tamil, and Kannada. So it could do that. That all that came about much later. Of course, the algorithms we used, the quality, it was more mechanical sounding. Then the world of AI has changed so dramatically today, and the whole technique for text to speech, all that has changed dramatically. But nevertheless, this was something that worked modestly well, I would say, and certainly was effective if you had somebody who was not very literate, but had to use the computer, it would just speak back to you, right? So yeah, those were all key innovations, I think, in those days. That
I think you missed probably one of them, which is annotation capabilities, wasn't it?
annotation capabilities. Yeah, so with the stylus, the entire design of the interface was that on any page you could write or draw or make whatever marks you want and save that, so that it's you want to make your notes, you want to just um, you see an interesting image, you want to mark out portions of that and then send it to somebody else. So all that was very native, very easily done. Yes, so that was certainly another big one.
What about connectivity? Like broadband and Wi-Fi was not a thing at the time. So how would people send it to each other?
Well, um, there were interfaces by which you could um, uh, connect to a computer and move things. Of course, that's hardly what you want to do in daily life. But point being, when we started, we did not think, and that's I think one key. Um, Something we I wouldn't say we overlooked, but maybe the technology was not there within reach at that point of time. But when we started, we did not think of the computer as a mobile phone. If you see how the revolution has happened, right? It started with telephony and saying you can talk to anybody anytime, and then data slowly pervaded and got into that format, and then everything moved datawards, and even telephony moved datawards, continues to move datawards at the moment, right? So a computing device versus a communications device, I think there's an important distinction between the two. Communication is sort of a more fundamental need. You want to just pick up the phone and talk to people, and when you start with that and then bring computing on top of it, it just becomes very powerful. We had computing alone without the communication, and that is perhaps one reason why it took us longer to sort of get to that adoption point. If this had been a mobile phone, I'm just thinking, right? People would have that's just a fundamental need, that you can talk from anywhere to anywhere. So I think that took us longer to get the mobile phone concepts into that. We never really, that was not a native thought process to begin with.
Yeah, I think now that you speak about Simputer, I think it was a Kindle and an iPad, and if it had been a mobile phone, I mean, I think it would have just gone off the shelves like crazy.
Yes.
But I think even in the case of Apple, they came up with the iPod first, and then they moved to phone. And then I still remember Steve Jobs' first reveal of the iPhone, where he says, it's an iPad, it's an iPod, and a phone all in one. So
yes,
yeah.
Yes. So music was his the sweet spot that he or Apple really started with, and hit it out of the park with that, saying this is a sharp use case, and then let's bring in other things, because now we have that mind share. Right? So I think you need something like that, communication, music, some very sharp thing that really captures everybody's imagination, and then you build all the other pieces, integrate all the other pieces into that.
Yeah. Well, Ramesh, we'll take a major pivot now. So after a few years, you completely move into a different space, strand genomics. I would like to, get a 101 from you on what your company does right now, and we'll dive deep into it a little bit.
So what the company does today, and what it started with was to say, we are seeing, and remember in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Human Genome Project was on. For the very first time, we could read the genome sequence of a human. Um, and in that context, it was clear that as the technology to understand the genome becomes better and better, the volumes of data that would result and the insights that would result would demand a fair amount of computing and algorithms, and we were all computer scientists. During my PhD days, I'd worked on problems related to so-called sequence analysis, was always curious about biology, and so started looking at it more and more as the Human Genome Project progressed, right? And that's how Strand came about, saying, we have computing, the use of computing in the life sciences to make an impact on health is going to be grow by leaps and bounds over the years, and we want to apply our skills in that space. 20 years later, or 20 odd years later, today, what does the company do? We are what we call an omics company. So we look at anything. So genomics is about sequencing the DNA, and you can sequence other related things, the RNA, proteins. There's a few other things that are there, and so we look at what can one do with two things. One is how can one sequence more effectively, more cost effectively? How can one build applications around this whole theme of sequencing? These applications are twofold. One is diagnostic applications. So how can we take a patient or even a person, a healthy person, sequence whatever aspect of their, there are many types of sequencing, as we've now learned. How can we sequence and say something about either their disease, how do you treat that disease, or what caused the disease, or can one detect disease early, etc. Right? And there's a slew of applications that we continue to build around that theme. The second theme is drug discovery. How can this knowledge, you sequence, how can that knowledge be used to design better drugs? When you use a drug, by the time you get into a human, it's often too late. So there are, you put it in organisms first or in model systems, and then the only way you can figure out what the drug is doing at a deep level is by doing sequencing. And that indeed results in data that has to be interpreted, and you have to get insights into the biology to say this is what the drug is possibly doing, and which means it might work or might not work or might create a lot of toxicity, etc. So what we do at Strand today is everything to do with sequencing. We sequence the genome in our labs. We create better and better ways to sequence in our labs. We create more cost-effective ways to sequence. We look at the data that results and say, how do we interpret the results? We create tools and software to analyze that data. And finally, from an applications perspective, we create applications in the diagnostics and therapeutics world. Those applications are constantly growing as our understanding of what can be measured with sequencing and how can it be applied for human health is getting better. So it's an evolving space.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I want to get a little bit of an understanding of who the customers are of Strand. Can you tell me a little bit about who is actually benefiting? I mean, I know there is a societal good with this research and engineering or biology, but who are the customers of Strand?
Yes. Got it. So let's focus on the diagnostic application theme first, and then I'll come to the therapeutic and drug discovery application theme. So in the diagnostic application theme, it's easier to understand because you're looking at you and I or any human and saying, how can I help figure out what you might be susceptible to, or if you already have something you're suffering with, what could the cause for that be? Let's take, of course, it's genomics is one tool among several that a doctor would need to, to treat, cure, diagnose disease. But this one tool, let me give you applications and then answer the question of who's the customer. So in the diagnostics world, the customer is typically a doctor who is ordering a test on behalf of a patient. And we are also entering into territory where we say, if you want to anticipatively, preventively check things, then it's the consumer themselves, because they don't have something that will make them go to a doctor yet. But there are things that they can learn about their risks that they can then go to a doctor with once they know they are at risk for something. So the customer is either a doctor who's referring a test, or on behalf of a patient, or the consumer themselves. Now let's talk about the applications. Why would a doctor refer a test to us, or why would a consumer, come to us? Uh, so there are a few different applications today for which genomics is becoming standard of care. Right? Number one, top of the list is what are called genetic diseases. About one in a couple of hundred people are born with a genetic disease. These people will it could be an extreme pediatric thing where you're not progressing, your developmental milestones are not there, you have neurological problems, you have structural problems that you're born with, or some organ is just not functioning. And these are fairly severe problems, right? And about 200 people are born with such sorts of problems. Most of them, or many of them, reflect early in life, in your infancy. Some of them may reflect when you get into your teens. A few may reflect when you get into your 20s and 30s and 40s. And just to give you an example, in my wife's family, my mother-in-law, several of her siblings started losing sight in their 30s, right? And so I'm just giving you this as an example to say that these are not obscure problems. They are there all around us, right? So in the 30s and 40s, several members of the family started losing vision. That's an example of a genetic disease. These are typically rare, as I said. It's a one in 100 or 200 people who would have such problems. But when they do have such problems, when the families do have such problems, there is really no alternative other than sequence the genome. Anything else does not get you an answer as to why this problem comes about. Right? And so, therefore, until about 10 years ago, this was almost impossible to get to a diagnosis. These families would just go from doctor to doctor, not know what to do. Starting about a decade ago, when sequencing started coming to the fore, at least this became accessible. And I would say about 5 years ago, this became mainstream, where it was not only accessible in countries like the West, but also accessible in India. Today, it's costs all of, let's say, 15,000 rupees or thereabouts to do something like this. And in a large number of cases, let's say, in many cases, you can actually identify which genomic character caused the problem. Right? So you have a diagnosis. That's called a diagnosis. I precisely understand that this is what has happened. And now you can use that in many cases. If it's a pediatric problem, you've had one child with the problem, you can use that to ensure that your next child can navigate around that problem. Right? So that's a powerful application. And if it's more of an adult onset thing, then it's a little harder, but at least you, in some cases, by knowing which gene has been affected, there are therapeutic options that that come to the fore, which otherwise you would be blinded to, and you would just be blindly sort of trying this and that. So that is, the whole notion of diagnosis of genetic disease is one key application. Cancer is the other key application. If you're a cancer patient, treatment is now dependent on what the DNA in the cancer. The DNA in the cancer, even though it's part of you, is different from your DNA because it's developed changes over a period of time. And what are those changes? Those changes in turn determine what treatment might be applicable. So you've got to sequence the tumor and then accordingly, decide what treatment might work best. So oncologists refer patients to us for sequencing their tumors. I mean, the third category is related but a little different in cancer. Everybody has a certain basal risk for lifelong risk for cancer. It's one in three or something like that, one in four people will get cancer in their lifetimes, thereabouts. But if you live long enough, that is. But some people are born with two in, let's say, 2 to 3 in 100 maybe, are born with an increased risk for cancer because they have a genetic inheritance that puts them at much higher risk. In popular consciousness, the Angelina Jolie story has took hold about a decade ago. She wrote about this extensively. She's one of those who has an substantially increased risk for cancer, right? And if you are one amongst these 2 or 3 in 100 people, there's enough in the medical guidelines to suggest that you have to take more action for surveillance, for prevention, and those steps are also laid out. So, and I know people who retrospectively realize this. They get cancer, gets very hard at that point of time, and then they think, I could have just done this 10 years ago and realized that I was at a higher risk and I could have taken actions to prevent, right? So this is for somebody who's not a patient yet, right? So 2 to 3 in 100 people. And there's enough in medical literature that says that if everybody in India, let's say every woman were to get screened in India for breast and ovarian risk, then about 250,000 lives could be saved and 750,000 cancer cases could be prevented. Right? So that's the third application. The fourth application, and I'll come to on the diagnostic front, is this is emerging really. All of us, whether we're born with an inherited risk or not, are at a increased risk are at some basal risk for cancer that might show up over a period of time in our lifetimes. And that's because our DNA also evolves with time. Exposure to sunlight, exposure to food, exposure to everything around us in the environment changes our DNA in some form. And there are ways now by which, using these genomics technologies, one can actually detect cancer early. And of course, detection early hopefully tantamounts to better survival, etc. So these are all applications that are being enabled by genomics. Some of these are already mainstream. Some are being actively researched and put out. Everything except for the last one that I mentioned, everything else is mainstream today. And the last one is in active development nowadays, and we'll hear more and more about it. So that's your sort of long answer to who's the customer and what are the applications. I'll be quick on the therapeutic side. On the therapeutic side, the customers would be any companies, pharma companies, biotech companies that are generating, that are trying to do drug discovery and using omics, how are genes reacting to the drug. So they generate all of this data, right? And then we work with them to help analyze that data, provide tools for that data, etc. So those are broadly our customer segments. So some of our customers are in the US, all the pharma companies, biotech companies. That's where the US, Europe, that's where the focus lies. And for our diagnostics work, where we work with doctors and patients, they are in India, because our focus there is in India. So we end up serving different sorts of customers on different continents. And in the US, all the diagnostic companies that do stuff similar to what we do in India, we work with them also to enable them with technology, rather than being a diagnostic company ourselves, going to doctors and patients. We enable US diagnostics companies with technology and software, while in India, we go all the way to the end where doctors and patients come to us, right? So that sort of summarizes in a long way what we do.
No, that's excellent. And thanks for sharing the details. Just on that note about cancer, I mean, do you just recommend that everyone gets a Gallery blood test done once in their life to know if they are in the risk of cancer? Because, that just seems to be the holy grail for, detection of cancer, at least in the West. And the second part of the question is, it's pretty expensive to get the test done. So do you think the cost can come down for probably some of the global South countries?
So just to correct you, I think the Gallery test is a different sort of test. It's one of those emerging things that is not a once in a lifetime test. That's repeated every whatever, every year, every 2 years. And I'll come back to that theme in a bit. But the once in a lifetime test is very mainstream now, right? We offer it. A bunch of companies in the West offer it. Lots of people have it. It's a question of adoption today. It's I think the closest catchword that comes to it, I mean, we could call it the BRCA1, BRCA2, or tests, or it was really pioneered by Myriad 20 years ago in the West, but the technology there was very expensive. But now it's 10,000 rupees or thereabouts, one can get this done in India, right? So it's a one-time test. You can get it done. So costs are already pretty low, and they will hopefully. I'm certainly seeing that 5 years from now, all the costs will come down by another factor of 20, 30, 40%, given how things are going, how technology is moving. So the once in a lifetime inherited risk test is ripe for large scale adoption. There is nothing stopping it. It's just awareness, and that only addresses those who are born with an inherited risk for cancer. Everyone has a risk for cancer, regardless of that, a baseline risk for cancer. It may not be elevated as a result of inheritance, but it is our DNA changes over our lifetime. And the Gallery test sort of falls in that bucket, that you've got to do ongoing surveillance. You've got to check every year, 2 years, and all of those numbers have to be, evidence on all of that is being generated, and we'll maybe 5-7 years from now, we'll have a much more sharper view of, should we do it every year, should we do it every 6 months. We do know that some cancers, just from the origin to shooting through to a late stage, are very fast, a matter of a few months, and therefore it might even have to be done every few months. But those numbers will come out. In terms of that particular test being expensive, of course, that's Grail offers that at about $1,000 in the US. In India, a number of us are working on related themes, and I'm sure we'll be able to offer it at a lot less in India. But it'll still be, few $100s, which from an Indian context is still not the best. I'm hoping the way technology is moving over the next 5 years, costs will keep coming down. It's certain that costs will keep coming down. Let's see where it ends up at. But I'm hopeful that 5 years from now, every person in India can get an early cancer detection test that costs, let's say, $100 or thereabouts. There are several challenges that theme that we have to figure out. I mean, the test is just the first step. The test will have false positives. What do you do next? How do you handle the anxiety that gets created? I mean, there's a number of themes that we have to figure out. All of that hopefully will get figured out over the next few years.
That's fantastic. I think cost coming down is pretty inevitable, and I hope it does. Well, Ramesh, thank you so much for your time. It was fantastic talking to you about Simputer and also your second endeavor with Strand Life Sciences. So thank you so much.
Thank you again, Bala. It was nice to have this conversation, and wishing you all the best with with this channel in general.
Thank you so much. Bye.